Welcome back to Ashkar Podcast. Today, we're tackling one of those huge questions, the ones that have probably kept people up at night since, well, forever. How did life even begin on Earth?
Yeah, it's a real head scratcher. Even with all we know now, we're still figuring out how we went from rocks and stuff to all these amazing living things we see.
Totally. So for this deep dive, we're looking at some really interesting theories about the very first life. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, I gotta say, it's just wild to think about going from those basic ingredients to single-celled organisms and then eventually all the way to us.
It's a crazy long journey, for sure, billions of years. And to really wrap our heads around it, we got to break it down. The source we're looking at focuses on four main things that define life: complexity, being able to replicate, having some kind of boundary, and of course, metabolism.
Okay, so let's start with that first one, complexity. This is where things get super interesting because some scientists actually think that the stuff that makes up life might have come from space.
Right. The Panspermia hypothesis, it basically says that when Earth was young, all these comets and meteors were smashing into it, and they might have carried these complex molecules like amino acids, those building blocks of life, like we got seeded from space.
I remember reading about scientists finding some pretty complex stuff out there, like glycine and urea. Oh, and what about that space vodka thing? Ethanol in space?
Yeah, that one got everyone talking. But beyond the fun headlines, it really shows that the ingredients for life could be way more common in the universe than we thought.
Okay, so we've got this stuff, these building blocks raining down on early Earth. But how do they go from just being there to, becoming something more? How did they form something that actually resembled life?
Well, one of the main theories is the primordial soup idea. Picture early Earth. Super hot, tons of volcanoes, lightning storms all the time. Now imagine little pools of water, kind of warm, filled with all those molecules that came from space. Bam! That's your primordial soup.
So basically like a giant chaotic lab where all this stuff is swirling around, getting zapped by lightning and cooked by geothermal heat.
Exactly. And it wasn't just some made-up idea. In the 50s, they did this experiment, the Miller-Urey experiment. They basically recreated those early Earth conditions, water, methane, ammonia, hydrogen, all that. And then they zapped it with electricity to be like lightning.
Oh.
They actually created amino acids and some other organic compounds, too.
Whoa. They made life in a test tube.
Not exactly life, but it was a huge deal. It showed that it's actually possible for those basic building blocks to turn into something more complex, just like we think happened on early Earth. It really backed up the idea of abiogenesis, that life came from non-living stuff.
Okay, so that's complexity check. But how did those early molecules, make copies of themselves, pass on information and actually multiply? How'd that happen?
This is where things get kind of surprising, because it looks like clay might have played a big role. There's this thing called the clay mineral hypothesis, and it says that the surfaces of clay could have, helped organize things and sped up reactions, and this could have led to, get this, RNA.
Hold up, RNA. I thought DNA was the instruction manual for life, the one with the genetic information.
Well, yeah, it is now, but RNA is simpler than DNA, but it can still store genetic information. And here's the kicker. It can also act like an enzyme, so it can make things happen, speed up reactions. And this is why we have the RNA world hypothesis. It says that RNA came first, even before DNA and proteins.
So RNA was the MVP of early life, doing it all.
Basically. Taking care of the information and running the show, too. There's more and more evidence for it all the time.
All right, so we've got complex molecules forming and making copies of themselves, but they're still just kind of floating around in this soup, right? How did the first cells actually come about? They needed some kind of wall, to separate themselves from everything else.
Think about what happens when you mix oil and water. They don't really mix, right? The oil just forms these little blobs. That's because the oil molecules, they don't like water. They're hydrophobic.
Right. It's like trying to wash a greasy pan. You need soap to break up all that oily stuff.
Exactly. And it turns out something similar happened when the first cells formed. Early Earth had lots of these things called lipids or fatty acids, and they're kind of like oils. They don't like water either. So in water, they form these little spheres called vesicles.
So these tiny little bubbles of lipids formed in the primordial soup, and they trapped those complex RNA molecules inside.
Yeah, that's the idea. These are called protocells, and they were a super important step towards actual cells. They had a boundary, stuff inside, and they could evolve and get more complex. But before we get there, let's talk about the first single-celled organisms. We've been talking about them in general, but there are two main types. prokaryotes and eukaryotes.
Yeah, I vaguely remember those words from bio. What's the difference again?
Prokaryotes are like the simplest cells, the first ones on Earth. Bacteria, archaea, all those single-celled guys that were hanging out in that primordial soup. They don't have a nucleus, so their DNA is just kind of floating around inside.
So their DNA is just out there in the open.
Exactly. Then you've got eukaryotes. They're more complex. They have a nucleus to hold their DNA and other little structures called organelles, like you and me, plants, animals. We're all eukaryotes.
So to get from those simple protocells to, like us, there had to be a pretty big jump from prokaryotes to eukaryotes.
Yeah, a huge jump. And it wasn't just like a slow, gradual thing. It was more like, ma'am, a merger. Two different types of prokaryotes got together.
Wait, a merger. Like one cell swallowed another one.
Kinda. It's called endosymbiosis. The idea is that billions of years ago, this bacterial cell got engulfed by an archaeal cell. But instead of getting digested, it just stayed there.
They decided to, share a cell.
It was more of a, hey, I can make energy, you're good at protection, let's team up. Over time, they just worked so well together that the bacterium basically became a permanent part of the cell, and it turned into what we now know as mitochondria.
Mitochondria. Those are like the powerhouses of our cells, right? I remember learning about those.
Yep. And check this out. Mitochondria still have their own DNA, separate from the DNA in the cell's nucleus. And guess what? It's super similar to the DNA of some bacteria.
So part of our cells, the part that gives us energy, used to be like its own thing.
Yeah.
An independent bacteria.
Pretty much. We have a lot of evidence for it. Not just the DNA thing, but also mitochondria have two membranes, which makes sense if they were engulfed. And they even replicate themselves on their own inside the cell.
That is so wild. This endosymbiosis thing, it was like a total game changer.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's one of the most important events in the history of life.
Yeah.
Mitochondria gave those eukaryotic cells a boost of energy. They'll let them grow bigger, become more complex, and eventually form, multicellular organisms.
So we might not even be here if those bacteria hadn't joined forces with other cells way back when.
It's very possible that complex life, like us, wouldn't exist. It really shows how powerful cooperation can be. And evolution, too. It can take some crazy turns.
Okay, so now we've got these eukaryotic cells powered up by their mitochondria buddies.
Mm-hmm.
But how did we go from single cells to, creatures with lots of cells? Did they just suddenly decide to, link arms and form a club?
Not quite. It was another long process. First, you had single cells clustering together, maybe for protection or to share resources.
Like a tiny little neighborhood watch.
Exactly. So you have this group of cells all hanging out together, forming a colony. And over time, some of them started to specialize, do different things. Some might have been good at movement, others at reproduction, stuff like that.
So they were dividing up the work, becoming more efficient and complex as a group.
Yep. And eventually they couldn't live on their own anymore. They became totally dependent on each other. Like they were all part of one organism.
It's kind of like how our society works. People specialize in different jobs, and we all work together.
That's a really good point. And just like societies become more complex when people specialize and work together, life on Earth did the same thing. Multicellularity opened up a whole world of possibilities.
And we're back. Still diving deep into the origins of life. We've gone from basic building blocks all the way to multicellular organisms. It's crazy how long this whole process took.
Oh yeah, billions of years. And becoming multicellular, that was just the start of another whole chapter. Life was about to get even more wild.
So what was it like for those early multicellular organisms? I mean, it couldn't have been easy, right?
You're right. There were tons of challenges. Like, for one, those individual cells had to learn how to talk to each other, and work together. They needed ways to get nutrients and signals around, and they had to come up with new ways to reproduce and develop.
So it wasn't just about sticking together. They had to, actually function as a team.
Exactly. It's like, think of a solo musician versus a whole orchestra. To play a complex piece of music, all those musicians have to be totally in sync, following the conductor. It's the same with a multicellular organism. Each cell has to do its job in harmony with all the others.
That's a great way to put it. So what were the perks of being multicellular? Why go through all that trouble?
Well, size was a big one. Multicellular organisms could get bigger, which helped them compete for food and avoid predators. Plus, they could specialize, different cells doing different things, like digestion or movement or sensing what's around them.
So like a division of labor, making things more efficient and complex overall.
Yep. And that specialization let them adapt to different environments. And eventually, well, we got all these different life forms from plants to insects to whales. It's incredible.
It's wild to think that all that diversity started with those basic ingredients in that primordial soup.
It really shows the power of evolution, how it can shape life into so many different forms. And remember, evolution never stops. Life on Earth is always changing and adapting.
So learning about how life began, it helps us understand not just the past, but also the present and the future.
Totally. It helps us see how connected all living things are and, what might be possible for life in the future, both here and out in the universe.
This deep dive has been amazing. We've gone from the first building blocks to those early cells to the incredible partnerships that made complex life possible, all the way to the diversity we see today.
And it all came from that one question. How did life begin? We may never have all the answers, but trying to find them has led to so many amazing discoveries and helped us see our place in the universe.
It really makes you think, knowing that we're all part of this giant story, that we share a common ancestor with every living thing on Earth.
And who knows what else we'll discover as we keep exploring. This is just the beginning.
Well said. And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the origins of life. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to get the latest updates. Until next time, stay curious.